was late spring of 1967. The war in South Vietnam was in full swing, with battles raging across the entire country. In the delta of the Grand Mekong River of South Vietnam, a company of the Mobile Riverine Force faced the harsh reality of war for the first time. Caught in the open land, the entire unit was pinned down by enemy fire. Without artillery and air support and no helicopters to evacuate the wounded, the chances of the soldiers surviving the day were minimal. The company had no other choice but to tighten its ranks and keep fighting. In such conditions, it is the bond between the soldiers that prevails. One can save his life only if he fights for the man next to him. This is one such story about the special bond within the Charlie Company of the 4th Battalion, 47th Infantry, the boys of 67 Charlie Company. Charlie Company was unique in several ways. When President Lyndon Baines Johnson approved a draft call in 1966, bringing more than 380,000 men under arms, it was enough to fill 1/3 of each unit deployed to Vietnam. In Charlie Company, this proportion was much higher. The unit was composed mostly entirely of draftees, with 99% of its members having been drafted. These were all young men, the majority being younger than 22 years, coming from all over the United States. The racial composition of the company followed the general pattern of the United States military. Although most of the soldiers were white, there were also a lot of Black and Hispanic soldiers, as well as Native and Asian Americans. Their social background also varied, as boys arrived from both middle-class and lower-class working families. These were the sons of businessmen, professionals, blue-collars, and farmers. Even their educational background was mixed. Most of the boys finished school, but only half of them had a high school degree, and even fewer with a college education. Such background naturally affected their stance on the war. While some felt resigned for being drafted and feared the service in Vietnam, others saw it as an opportunity and adventure. A patchwork of racial, cultural, and social backgrounds, the Charlie Company was the United States in miniature. However, life in the unit was about to make all these differences disappear. There, they all became one, a good fighting man. However, becoming an infantry soldier was not an easy task, though. It was something these boys learned when they arrived at Fort Riley for their training course. Each day began at 4:30 a.m. and was filled with intense physical exercises, including runs in full gear and obstacle courses designed to build stamina and strength. The soldiers also went through simulated combat scenarios and practiced river crossing techniques and other skills specific to the challenges of combat in Vietnam. However, the most significant part of the training was learning to work as a team. In the Mekong Delta, where the company was headed, a soldier could survive only by fighting alongside his comrades. And so it was. As the training course progressed, it forced soldiers to bridge their cultural and racial divides and act as a team. They lived, worked, and trained together, which helped form strong bonds among them, relationships that were crucial for building a strong unit. However, none of that would matter if the unit they belonged to was not unique for one more thing. Namely, the 9th Infantry Division, to which the 47th Infantry belonged, was the only division at the time that trained and deployed men together. It was a common practice during World War II, but the Army abandoned it by the time of the war in Vietnam. Men of the Charlie Company were lucky to fight along with the men that they knew well and had strong bonds with. Being part of a strong and cohesive unit was especially important because the 9th Infantry Division was deployed to one of the most challenging areas in South Vietnam, the delta of the Mekong River. The Mekong Delta was essential in war operations because it was used by the Viet Cong to transport supplies and communicate across South Vietnam, which helped them in the war. The delta was also very fertile, making it a key place for growing rice, which was important for feeding the local population and the soldiers. The problem, however, was that the Viet Cong had a strong presence in the region, controlling a large area and using the delta's waterways to move supplies. The United States and South Vietnam wanted to take over control of the delta, cut off the Viet Cong's supplies, and stop them from moving freely. This strategy was meant to weaken the Viet Cong and change the way the war was fought, moving it from a guerrilla war to a more traditional fight. This, they believed, could decide the outcome of the war. With the South Vietnamese army unable to deal with the Viet Cong by itself, the American Military Assistance Command decided to send some troops to help. This included the deployment of specialized river units and eventually the deployment of the 9th Infantry Division. On January 9, 1967, Charlie Company, along with the rest of the division, boarded the USS General John Pope, a World War II-era troopship. After 20 days at sea, they arrived at Vung Tau Harbor in South Vietnam. As the men gathered their gear and prepared to disembark, they caught their first glimpse of Vietnam. In the distance, tracer rounds were lighting up the sky above a battlefield. They were at war. The following day, the company moved to the Rung Sat Special Zone, a difficult terrain with swamps and dense mangroves. Patrolling the area required the Americans to use boats and helicopters for movement, as the ground was almost impossible to enter on foot. This was the way Charlie Company would enter the zone when deployed to their typical 3-day missions. Men were never sent to longer missions because spending more than 3 days in the swamps risked men causing immersion foot, a severe injury similar to trench foot from World War I. Each platoon usually patrolled separately with a primary mission to locate and destroy enemy base camps. These were typically small mounds of mud just above the waterline, equipped with a few bunkers and shanties. Maneuvering through the swamp was slow and dangerous, with a constant risk of getting lost in the treacherous terrain. There were delays when platoons advanced not more than 200 yards. The company had mixed success in its missions. Although they discovered several enemy camps, almost always these were abandoned minutes before their arrival. This was because American soldiers produced great noise as they battled through the mangrove roots and mud. To conceal their movement, platoon commanders used the tactic of walking through streams. Patrols in the Rung Sat zone were conducted from the Dong Tam base. When the soldiers first arrived, the base was nothing more than a barren piece of land, and it required a significant effort to transform it into a functional military camp. Even after it was organized, the camp remained a miserable place to stay. Rats and insects infested the area, and the climate was unbearable. However, it was these harsh conditions that helped the soldiers quickly adapt to the tough environment of Vietnam. Despite the difficulties, the soldiers kept their morale high by sharing jokes and building close bonds with one another. They even formed close relationships with the local Vietnamese, especially the children. When not at the Delta, Charlie Company was engaged in patrols through the Mekong Delta. Although they didn't see much action on these missions, they were still highly dangerous, as the threat of booby traps and sniper attacks was always present. However, in early June 1967, things were about to change dramatically. After the encounter with the U.S. 199th Infantry Brigade, Viet Cong's 5th Na Bay Battalion retreated to the area near the village of Can Dua in the Mekong Delta. For the final destruction of the VC Battalion, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam decided to send 2 battalions of the 47th Infantry to the area. Charlie Company and 2 other companies from the 4th Battalion were ordered to land on the beaches south of Can Dua and advance toward enemy positions. As soon as they received orders to move, the men of the Charlie Company knew something big was going on. This was the first time the entire company was put into action. Armored troop carriers carrying Charlie Company arrived on the beaches near Can Dua just after sunrise on June 19th. The men got off their boats and began moving through the area, but found no sign of the enemy. As they moved through abandoned rice paddies, soldiers started to think this was going to be another boring day in the field. But then new orders came in. Intelligence said a large group of Viet Cong was dug in nearby. Alpha Company started moving toward the position on foot, while Charlie Company reboarded their ATCs to move to their designated LZ. Once close to their target, the company disembarked and moved on foot, leaving the 4th platoon on boats to shadow their movement by following up the stream on the company's right flank. As the company moved through the rice paddies, the stream's current drifted the 4th platoon ahead of the company. Aware that they were too exposed, men from the 1st platoon tried to radio them, but suddenly the gunfire erupted. Only a few dozen feet away and hidden in the foliage, the Viet Cong opened fire on 2 boats with 50 caliber machine guns. The soldiers on board were caught in the open, and 6 of them were killed almost instantly. The boats broke apart, and the bodies of the soldiers fell into the water. Lieutenant Schulman, the platoon leader who was on the ground as there was no room for everyone on the boats, watched in horror as his men were shot down. Overcome by the horrendous scene, he too was caught by enemy fire and shot dead. At the same time, the 2nd platoon, moving on foot, was also hit by intense fire. The Viet Cong fired upon them from well-hidden bunkers, also using 50 caliber machine guns. The platoon couldn't move forward or retreat. Lieutenant Jack Benedict, the platoon leader, yelled for his men to return fire while medics tried to help the wounded. Men responded with everything they had, including grenade launchers and M72 light anti-tank weapons. However, the Viet Cong were well entrenched in bunkers. Even with artillery support, the soldiers were outgunned. On the left flank, the 1st platoon faced the same situation. The lucky circumstance was that they took cover behind a dike that Viet Cong's heavy machine gun could not shoot through. Still, they too were unable to advance. Captain Herb Lind, in command of Charlie Company, called for artillery and air support to help break the enemy's pressure. Artillery shells started falling behind the enemy's position and slowly moved closer. F-100 Super Sabre jets flew overhead and dropped 750-pound bombs on the VC bunkers. One bomb scored a direct hit on the 50 caliber bunker that had been firing at 1st Platoon. The explosion destroyed the bunker and its crew, and the men cheered. However, the fire against the 2nd and 3rd platoons remained intense. As if all this wasn't enough, these 2 platoons found themselves under friendly fire. The forward air controller had mixed up the location of the targets and directed a pod of rockets at platoons. Luckily, the rockets landed just short of their positions. If Colonel Tutwiler, who was in a helicopter above the battlefield, hadn't called off further airstrikes, the 2nd airstrike would surely have been fatal. With each minute, the company's situation was getting worse. Wounded men were scattered across the field, crying for help. Medics were all over the place, running through the rain of bullets to come to aid their wounded comrades. Charlie Company was stuck, with casualties piling up and ammo running low. At one point, the soldiers started thinking they were not going to get out of this thing alive, especially when they heard over the radio that further north, Alpha Company was annihilated in combat against the VCs. Not even the arrival of helicopters to bring resupplies lifted their spirits. One of the helicopters, after it picked up an injured soldier, was hit by an enemy 50 cal. Soldiers on the ground watched in horror as they saw their buddy fall off the chopper, which then came crashing down on top of him in the rice paddy. As if things couldn't get any worse for the men of the Charlie Company, enemy snipers crawled behind their backs and started shooting at them. Hours passed as Captain Lind and his men desperately fought against the VCs. Artillery and airstrikes weren't working against the enemy bunkers, and there was no way any more choppers would come to evacuate the wounded. At 4 p.m., though, a call came in from U.S. Navy Commander Dusty Rhodes aboard one of the monitor gunboats in the river. Rhodes proposed Lind to bring his 60-foot-long and nearly 18-foot-wide monitor, armed with 40mm cannon and 81mm mortar, up a narrow stream between Charlie Company and the enemy. Lind warned him this could be a suicide mission, but Rhodes was determined to help. Rhodes moved his boat towards the VC bunkers, with Captain Lind directing him, walking along the dike showered by enemy gunfire. The boat opened fire, hitting the Viet Cong bunkers and causing explosions. The men cheered and shot at the enemy soldiers fleeing from their positions. Finally, after hours of fighting, the enemy pressure eased enough for medics to pull the wounded to safety. Lind's exhausted men were ordered to pull back to the river. They believed the fighting was over and that the airstrikes would finish off the enemy positions once they left. However, the battle was anything but over, as the remnants of the Alpha Company were still trapped. There was no one else to rescue them except Lind's men. 1st and 2nd platoons were told to get more ammunition because they would be attacking the enemy again. Under the command of Lieutenant Hunt, 25 men, exhausted by day-long fighting, moved toward enemy positions. At one point, someone on the right flank started screaming. It was a primal animal screaming that swept the unit like a wave. All of a sudden, everyone started screaming. Defying death, soldiers charged against the enemy bunkers, unaware if the enemy were firing back or not. It didn't matter at all. It was time for revenge. Atop the bunkers, the fighting was chaotic. On all sides, men were throwing grenades into the bunkers, yelling and firing at the Viet Cong, who started to run in panic. "We've got him now, we've got him on the run," someone yelled. American soldiers showed no mercy. Viet Cong were shot down as they fled, as they crawled away. Not even female soldiers were spared. And then suddenly, everything stopped. The Viet Cong were all dead, and there was nobody left to shoot at. Charlie Company reinforced their positions and spent the night expecting a counterattack from the Viet Cong that never came. The following day, they reached the positions of the Alpha Company only to find its commander, Captain Reeves, wandering in shock among the bodies of the fallen soldiers. Alpha Company had sustained a 90% casualty toll. At the time, soldiers considered the unit to go through heavy fighting if it sustained 20% casualties. Charlie Company secured the perimeter and began gathering the bodies of the dead. Each body had a story. Some soldiers were killed instantly, while others tried to crawl to safety before being hit again. Soldiers worked in pairs to identify the dead, strip them of their gear, and drag their bodies back to the boats. The men were deeply affected by these scenes. It was too much even for the toughest of soldiers. However, only as they returned to the base did they realize the true scale of the horror they survived. When they disembarked from ATCs onto the barge, the first thing they saw was a 4-foot-high and 10-foot-wide pile of web gear stripped from dead soldiers. When they passed by the Alpha Company's quarters, they were welcomed by an eerie silence. There was no one inside. Their own quarters were also awkwardly empty, with more than a third of the company's bunks vacant. 11 men from the company had been killed that day, with more than 40 wounded. As months passed and Charlie Company continued to fight in the unforgiving swamps of the Mekong Delta, the psychological toll became more and more apparent. The constant threat of death and witnessing the loss of friends left deep scars. The strain of combat had a lasting effect on soldiers' mental health, with many carrying the burden of what they saw and did for the rest of their lives. However, the struggles they endured helped these soldiers become better people. Many soldiers had never interacted closely with people from different races before the war. However, being in battle together made those differences seem less important. Their survival depended on trusting each other. The shared experience of combat brought men of the Charlie Company together in ways that erased racial and social boundaries. Steve Hopper, for example, wrote home about how his feeling towards black soldiers changed. He wrote about how grateful he was to have Elijah Taylor, a black medic, save his life during a battle. He realized that in war, it didn't matter what color someone was. Everyone was a buddy, and they all depended on each other for survival. His own experiences taught him to value his comrades for their actions, not their race. Indeed, in the heat of battle, soldiers didn't care about their differences. What mattered was whether the person next to them could be trusted to watch their back. The soldiers in Charlie Company relied on each other in life or death situations. These shared experiences created bonds that lasted a lifetime. They became the Band of Brothers. Thank you for watching this episode. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up and please share it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Stay tuned.